Chris in Connecticut. Welcome to the show. You want to talk a little bit about philosophical conversations today?
Yeah, hi guys.
Hi.
So, yeah, long time no talk. I don't know if you guys remember me. I think I called in like when the show was kind of brand new, and we were talking a little bit about my crazy evangelical boss.
I remember you.
So happy update on that. I just set my defense date. So in April, I will officially be Dr. Chris.
Nice.
So
Congratulations. Yay.
Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, and I guess for the topic today, there was just listening to you and kind of some of the other call-in shows, like this last couple of weeks, I've been noticing this like theme that seems to be happening where, you know, the apologists will kind of call in, point to some like fact and reality, and then make this like ontological model that explains it, but then never really question that ontological explanation, right? They just kind of think that it's as clear as like if you go outside, you can see the sky is blue.
Right. Look at the trees.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's like, you know, some examples I remember like the C.S. Lewis guy who was talking about like, oh, like, what, do you think the cell is not complex? Or, you know, like they move the conversation from looking at, well, what is the ontological reason for these facts we're describing, and instead try to just change the conversation into understanding why you don't just obviously see that they're correct. And I'm wondering, like, how do you like cut through the fat with that to actually get them to go back to like the real kind of meat of the conversation? Because I don't think you can move forward like the other way.
Right. I think, honestly, this is really fun that you called in about this topic, because Eric and I were just talking about kind of what comes first when building a worldview. Is it ontology? Is it epistemology? Is it axiology? Where do we begin in that building of a worldview? And that might actually end up being our next versus conversation. I have some thoughts, but Eric looked like he wanted to jump in real fast. So Eric, go for it.
Sure. So first thing that I wanted to say is actually that's a really great time to kind of address one of the big things that get in the way of these kinds of conversations. And that is the difference between an honest and dishonest interlocutor and an honest and dishonest tactic. So I think that there are lots and lots of believers who will kind of do that, right? They'll bring up an argument and then they'll shift into kind of, well, why don't you believe, instead of talking about the argument, or, you know, things like that. I think that the tactic itself does not lend itself to solving any of the problems or having a meaningful discussion. So I would say it's a dishonest tactic, but that doesn't mean that the interlocutor, the person who's giving that tactic, recognizes that. It doesn't mean that they know it, and it doesn't mean that they're trying to do that purposefully to mislead you. And so the first thing to do is kind of recognize that. And if you can find ways to go, hey, you know what? I understand you. I hear you. But that's actually a conversation that's a little bit different from what we're specifically talking about. So I'm happy to talk to you about one of them or whichever one you want to talk about, but let's make sure that we're on the same page. You know what I mean? Often that will clear it up. I've seen lots and lots of possibly great discussions devolve into yelling matches because no one was willing to do that one step. And that could have been all the difference they needed to move forward and have a productive discussion.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I mean, there's a specific reason that I choose to talk about why we disagree as opposed to what we disagree on. First of all, I think it's just more interesting. I think that I am more fascinated by how people come up with their beliefs than I am in the beliefs themselves, especially because while the beliefs can vary from person to person, the tactics that are used to come to those beliefs are actually fairly straightforward and similar across the board. So, for example, if somebody were to call in and say, well, I believe that God exists, there is the obvious tactic, well, which God? You know, I don't believe God exists, and talk about it in those ontological terms. But there's also the option of saying, hey, How do you know that? And to me, that's the more interesting conversation. And it's the one that gets more out of the other person, because otherwise it just becomes kind of banging your head against a wall where one person's saying there is a thing and the other person is saying there isn't. And there's really very few ways to determine who is correct without moving into how we know things and the kinds of evidence that we accept as compelling. And so a lot of the time, if you move people away from trying to defend that a thing exists or that a thing is real, that's where all of their tension is bound up. That's where all of the conflict lives. And if you want to get into that conflict, that's where you go. But if you want to have a larger conversation and actually address the core issue there, moving them away from that and into a conversation around what do you consider to be good evidence about a thing? Or could this be stemming from past experiences or education or indoctrination and building in that direction ends up addressing the initial question a lot better and without all of the unnecessary conflict. So that's kind of where I come at that from. But again, that's just me. What are your thoughts, Chris?
Yeah, I think, I agree with the majority of what both of you had said. I guess it's just kind of difficult to, steer the conversation more into that philosophy realm, especially since most people, I never had a philosophy course in my life until I went to a Catholic college. So there's not a lot of, I guess, education even around the usage of some of these words, let alone the actual structure of how to go into those conversations. So it's kind of difficult, even when you're trying to make the point to get them to realize, I'm not saying the cell is that complex. I'm saying that doesn't necessarily mean it was made by a mind.
Right, exactly. Right. Exactly. That's a really good point. And I think that there's a bad way to do that as well, right? The reason that I focus on philosophy and not science, at least not in the way that I would want to in terms of refuting creationists or refuting people against reproductive rights, that kind of thing, is because I know that that's not what I am educated in, and I don't want to speak into a subject that I don't know very well, because that's just a recipe for disaster later on. So I keep it in the philosophical realm because that's where I'm comfortable and that's where I feel like I have things to offer. But there are some really amazing people out there. Student Dr. Ben is starting a channel, and he is a med student who is addressing a lot of these issues from the scientific side of things. Katie Montgomery is a trans activist who talks a lot about the biology behind all of that. So there are definitely people who I would point to if somebody was like, give me a scientific reason why creationism is wrong, five reasons, 5 ways to debunk this. I'm going to go push them towards Vice Rhino, but for
that's
us,
really interesting. This will be my last thing. I know you guys have other callers, but it's kind of interesting that you brought up, trying to have the conversation from where you're most knowledgeable or most comfortable. Mm-hmm. And I actually would love to get Eric's opinion on this, because he was talking a little bit about dishonest versus honest interlocutors, where in my experience, because I do have more of a science background and I try to do kind of exactly what you're saying, Reed, then all of a sudden they'll realize, oh, okay, you have some level of education on the subject. Let's move to history. Let's talk about that bit from that angle. Mm-hmm. How you and would you say that is more of more of a dishonest tactic, or how would you look at that?
Sure. Well, I don't think that it's a dishonest person necessarily. But yeah, I would say the tactic itself is not a good one. But I also kind of understand it. When I'm going through and I'm working on some philosophical idea, I throw everything, including the kitchen sink, at it. I am just trying to see if I can falsify that, that premise so that I can move forward. And so if, I put myself in those shoes and I'm having a discussion with somebody about biology, and my entire premise there is, the mystery of biology means that, God did it. And I talk to somebody who is well-versed in biology, and they go, well, no, this is the case. Oh, well, what about all of these other things? If you come across something that all of a sudden fits that, you're like, okay, well, what else? I think that the best thing to do moving forward from there is to hold on the topic for just a little bit longer. It's uncomfortable, but say, actually, you were talking about biology. I'm happy to talk about history, but you brought up a point about biology. I answered that. Do you still think that biology holds this key that you were talking about? If so, why? And if not, then are you going to continue using this specific argument in the future? You know, because I've seen it in debates, I've seen it in one-on-one discussions, and I've seen it on shows. If someone is calling in, or, you know, even if they're on this side of the camera, if you say something really important, but you keep talking, that important thing is going to get lost. You know, you don't get the chance to hammer it home. And if it's really a big deal, it deserves that little bit of extra time to hammer home, because people otherwise are just going to, okay, on to the next thing. And they don't realize that you just fucking answered them, you know? So I would say that, you know, in those discussions, in really any format that I've seen, if you're having a talk with somebody and, you know, you sufficiently respond and they want to change the topic, call it out. You don't need to be mean. Don't say, oh, you're changing the topic. Say, oh, well, it sounds like you want to talk about something else. I just want to make sure that we're done talking about this. I answered you. Did that suffice? Was that answer enough to convince you that you were wrong about this one thing? You know, like, make it super clear, because that forces them to stop for just a second and recognize that they have to think about that for a little bit. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it definitely makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks, guys. I'll just get off the line now. Love what you do. Keep it up, and I'll keep tuning in.
Thank you so much, Chris, and congratulations on that degree.
Yeah, congrats.
Thank you. All right, have a good one.
Bye.
You too.
Oh my goodness. You say, I don't understand how people say congrats and not congrats.
You say a number of words weird.
I do. It's probably from the fact that I have lived on every single quadrant of the U.S. at some point in my life.
Well, you said you were doing a collab, which is the only way I've ever heard it said, but you call it a collab.
I just put, I guess I put syllables on the wrong,
emphasis
emphasis on the wrong syllables.
Yeah.
Something like that. So there is a lot of open space on our call line right now. So if you would like to give us a call and chat with us about anything, feel free to reach out at 585-526-8774.
Yeah, we don't want to vamp. We don't have a lot of callers. Come on, guys. If now's the time. If you want to call in, you're probably going to get through. Just make sure it's something that's worth talking about, that it's something we can dialogue about.
Absolutely.